Greetings and welcome back to the channel. Today we're building storage shelves for your garage or basement that provide a maximum of storage capacity with a minimum of space, and even better, at a minimum of cost. And for a bonus, they can be built to include a sturdy workbench and can be easily accessorized to add even more workspace and storage capacity. In this first of two parts, we'll help you to adapt the design to fit the space that you're using, and then walk you step by step through the building process for the basic structure. In the next video, we'll show you how to add to that structure if you'd like, to make it even more perfect for your own workshop or storage space. The concept that makes this unit special is the application of engineering principles to reduce the size and the amounts of wood required without sacrificing structural strength. This keeps the cost of the project down and maximizes the use of space. Like most DIYers, I've built many shelves and workbenches over the years, and my usual go-to plan for making them heavy-duty was simply to add bulk to the wood sizes. Many a bench has been built of 4x4s and multiple layers of MDF, and they all weigh a ton and take up a ton of space. This time, however, I was tasked by my neighbor Piper to build a shelf unit in her garage that would double as an equipment storage unit and also a workbench. Hers is a single-car garage, so the unit was limited by that dimension and width. But in that space, she needed enough shelf space for storing not only a lot of household items, but also a rolling tool chest and a compressor. Somehow, I also had to squeeze in a sturdy work surface for her mechanic projects, and the project was limited to a $200 budget. Well, I exceeded that budget, but not by much. But I did manage to meet all the other requirements. As always, it's best to start with a plan, so I measured the rear wall of her garage, shown here in gray, and made scale drawings of the space. I also added scale images of the tool chest and the compressor so I could set the height of the lowest main shelf, which would also be a workbench, and also the position of the vertical posts. Note that the shelves in this case are only ½ an inch thick, but they're faced with a 1x4 board, which is part of the structural concept. For a stronger bench, you could substitute thicker plywood at an increased cost. Also note that the posts are 2x4s. This keeps the footprint of the posts small, and as long as they're properly supported, they'll carry a surprisingly large load. In fact, a single regular 2x4 is rated to support as much as 1,000 pounds vertically as long as it's supported to prevent bending. And since we're using 8 of these 2x4 posts, that's a combined weight-bearing capacity of 8,000 pounds, which coincidentally enough is about the weight of a small elephant. And of course, I wouldn't sit under that structure with an elephant on the top bench, but the point is made. The heaviest box of storage materials that I have is some reloading equipment, and that box weighs about 40 pounds. And most of my wife's decorating materials have an average box weight of less than 30 pounds, and I think the heaviest one has candles in it, and that might be 35. So theoretically, if I filled up all 28 of these boxes with 50 pounds each, which is a lot, I'd still only have a total load of 1,400 pounds, which is so far below the capacity of 8,000 that I hope you begin to realize how overbuilt so many garage benches and storage shelves are. Now that we've discussed the structural concepts of this unit, let's take a look at some of the more specific design features that you might want to modify to suit your own particular needs. If you're planning to use the center area to store a tool chest, as shown here, don't forget to include enough space on each side to be able to parallel park it against the back wall. If you've modified that tool chest to have 4 castering wheels, as we showed in a previous video, this is less of a problem. But a standard chest will require a few inches on either side, so set your vertical post distances accordingly. Also, if you're going to use the lower shelf as a workbench, the height would ideally be lower than the one shown here. It's necessary to have a high bench top in this case to accommodate the tool chest and the compressor. But if you don't have those requirements, you can lower the bench to a comfortable height. In this case, a stand-up workbench is fine for the purposes that we're building it for. Once the height of the lowest shelf and the spacing of the 4 vertical posts is decided, the other shelf position, the upper one, is determined by your ceiling height. We built this one to allow a double stack of banker's boxes because we had enough ceiling height for that. Banker's boxes aren't just a random choice for planning purposes either. The ones shown, which are store file 701s, are a great way to organize your household and garage storage. I keep many of my specialty tools and equipment in them, and my wife uses them to store all of her seasonal household decorations. She likes to redecorate for every holiday or season change, and the banker's boxes allow her to swap their contents each time she redecorates. So in this design, I used the dimensions of the 701 box to determine the shelf height and also the shelf depth, which is 2 feet. And so, with all those goals in mind, we set about building our shelves. We had no problem meeting all the design requirements, but we did go over budget. Piper didn't want to spend more than $200, but I think the total price came at right around $225, well under $250 in any case. We're still in the middle of winter right now, and she's going to wait for warmer weather to finish painting the shelves and adding a few extra features, but she's happy with the results so far, and so am I. Now let's walk through the building procedure step by step so you can see how we did it. Here's a list of the tools we used. Nothing special or expensive, and of course you can substitute whatever you prefer. You might not even need that stud finder depending upon what type of wall you're mounting these shelves to. As for materials, this is a list of the lumber that Piper bought at Home Depot for a total of a bit over $200, and you might be able to beat those prices if you shop around. But in any case, only buy the straightest 2x4s and 1x4s you can find with the fewest number of knots. The plywood thickness we chose was 1/2 inch, but if you anticipate very heavy loads or impacts, you can substitute whatever thickness you can afford. In either case, get plywood that has at least one sanded surface. Also, while you're at the store, if you can, have them cut the plywood down to the width of your shelves. In our case, we needed the shelves to be 2 foot wide to accommodate the banker's boxes, so we had both of these sheets sewn right down the middle. Now, even though you could technically assemble this whole project with screws alone, don't neglect the construction adhesive that we're recommending. The product we use is liquid nails. It's a very common product, but it's essential to getting the full strength out of these lighter weight materials. Of course, you will need some screws, and we use drywall screws in several lengths, plus 8 lag screws. The length of the drywall screws could depend upon your choice of plywood thickness, so I recommend that you review the construction steps and adjust your needs accordingly before you go to the store. Actual construction begins with installing a pair of those 1x4 boards against the back wall of your garage. Now keep in mind that no garage has perfectly plumb walls or a level floor. So just pick one side or the other to take your measurements from, and then once those measurements are established, we will level these boards to those measurements. Now, you have to decide a few things. How high will the workbench or the lower shelf be? 38 inches is a comfortable height for a bench, but in our case we had to go higher, as we said earlier, to accommodate that tool chest. Once you've picked a dimension, you have to live with it because these boards are going to be attached very firmly to the walls, so make sure you're happy with it before you move on. Then above that, we need as much space as necessary to accommodate sizes of boxes or other storage. The dimensions that we used here was 7 feet to the upper bench level, and for us we had 2 feet of space above that with this very high ceiling in Piper's garage. Your ceiling might be lower, so you might have to lower that shelf if you want to accommodate 2 sets of boxes, or just live with having a single row like it mentions here. At this point we need to draw some lines at those 2 heights that we've selected, and I think the best way to do that is to use the boards themselves as a straight edge. pick the 2 straightest possible boards that you can find out of the 4 you purchased and cut them to the width of your workspace. In this case, it's from one wall of the garage to the other, and we cut them to be a good tight fit in that distance. And then with a helper, hold that board up to the mark you made above the floor on the one side that you chose as your master reference. Stick a level across the top of your 1x4 as it shows here in this drawing, and then draw a pencil line at that point all the way across the wall. Again, it's helpful to have 2 people doing this so that you can extend that line from one side to the other. And don't forget what I said earlier, you can't just measure up from the floor on each end because your floor will be sloped. You need to pick one side of the room, let's say the right side in this case, make your mark, in this case 7 feet from the floor, hold the board up to that mark, put a level on the board, and then have your partner move the other end of the board up or down until that level is perfectly straight, and then draw a nice dark pencil line across the top of the board. Make a line for both of the shelves, both the upper shelf and the lower bench shelf, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Now that we have a couple of lines drawn on the wall to tell us where those boards are going to be attached, we need to decide how to attach them. We're illustrating here a stud wall, and that's where your stud finder comes in, and this will give you a good strong installation by using 1/4 inch lag screws to about 2 inches long, could be longer. If you use lag screws, be sure to put some large area washers under the head of the screw so you don't crush the wood too much while you're tightening them down. Now take your time doing this. Make sure these boards are exactly on those lines you drew and that you're happy with how straight and level they are. These 2 boards form the foundation for all the rest of the structure, so we need them to be perfectly straight and level so that the rest of the assembly looks good. Now we're going to take 4 of those nice straight 2x4s you bought and cut them to the exact height of that upper 1x4. Now don't forget that these 2x4s will all be slightly different lengths because the floor is sloped. Just put them up one at a time in the position where they're going to be attached and mark their tops where that top meets the upper edge of the upper 1x4, and then make your cut at that point. Once you do have all of them cut to the correct height, I recommend that you either number them or mark them in some way so that you can be sure to put them back in the same position when you're ready to screw them on. Now you don't absolutely have to perform the next step, so look ahead through this process and decide if you really want to. We're going to notch these boards to set them back up against that rear wall of the garage, and the reason we're doing that is it gives us a little more open space in the second shelf, the lower shelf. If you don't make these notches, these boards will intrude on that space, and I was looking to gain every square inch I could, so I went ahead with this process. To make these notches, push the 2x4s back into position where they're going to be up against those 1x4s, and use a pencil to mark where the notch will have to be cut. Once you've done that for all 4 of the 2x4s, you can lay them down on their side and use a scrap piece of 1x4 that's left over when you cut them to length, and use that to set the rear side of the notch. Make a nice dark pencil line because that's going to be our cut line. Now you could go ahead and use a ordinary handsaw and a hammer and chisel to make these notches. I chose to use a jigsaw, and the simplest way that I know of to do that is to start with making a couple of cuts at each end of the notch as shown in the top drawing, and then I come in from one side with the jigsaw in a curving arc and cut over to the left side until that piece breaks away, and then come back in for another cut coming in from the right to straighten that cut over to the other side of the notch. Now you'll need to put each one of those boards up into position to check the fit of the notches, and don't be surprised if it's too tight to fit in some areas. Go ahead and enlarge these notches as much as necessary to make it an easy fit. Also, don't be dismayed if these boards don't fit perfectly flat against the wall. Very few walls are actually flat, and in the case of the one we were working on in Piper's garage, that wall had more waves than Pismo Beach, and there wasn't any way we were going to get those boards to sit straight up against it. Once the whole thing is assembled, you can hardly notice any gaps like that anyway, so just don't worry about it. Now, it's a good idea at this point to review your plans to be absolutely certain about the spacing of these 2x4s, the ones shown here in purple, to make sure they are absolutely where you want them to be, because we're about to anchor them into position permanently. The way we attached our vertical 2x4s was to angle the screws, a process called skew screwing, to anchor them to the 1x4s, and in fact our screws went on through into the 2x4 studs in the wall behind us. Of course, there's other ways of doing this, and you could even use lag screws, as it shows on the right side of this drawing, if by some miracle your 2x4s happen to be right in front of a stud in the back wall. Regardless of how you attach them, though, this is the final result, what you should see at this point in your construction. As I'm looking at this photo, I realized that I didn't mention earlier that we painted this whole garage white before we started putting up these shelves. It's a lot easier to paint the walls when there isn't the obstruction of all these pieces of wood, so I strongly recommend that you do the same. I also recommend that you choose white as your color, and we picked the whitest white we could find and bought several gallons of it. In a garage, it's my belief that there's never enough light, and basically anything that's white in your garage is reflecting light and making it brighter, and anything that isn't white is basically sucking up the light and making things darker. So white is always my go-to choice for garage workshops. Next up in our construction sequence are the two vertical posts that will support the front of the shelves, shown here in pink. These actually, on our set of shelves, will be attached to the walls on each side of the garage, but there are some options that we'll discuss later if you need one of these posts to be freestanding. First, we have to decide how far they have to be from the back wall, however, and in our case, for these shelves to be 24 inches, these posts must be installed so they are 23 1/4 inches from the wall to the front face of each 2x4. That missing 3/4 of an inch, 0.75, will be the thickness of the 1x4 that we use as a fascia board for both the top and bottom shelves. So if you're going to build shelves that are 2 feet wide, these vertical posts must be 23 1/4 inches from the back wall to the front of the post, as shown in this drawing. Make sure you study that and understand it before you proceed. For our shelves, we measured that 23 1/4 inch dimension on each wall, the right hand and the left hand walls of the garage, and then we placed our 2x4s in that position at that dimension from the back wall. We then held a level up against the post vertically to check it for plumb, to make sure that post was absolutely straight up and down, and then made a mark along the wall so that we knew where that post was supposed to be when it's finally installed. Then it's a matter of cutting the post to length, and to do that we laid a level across from the back post, as you can see in the upper right hand corner, and marked where that level, with the bubble centered, crossed the 2x4. Now, before we move on to the next step, I did mention earlier that these posts don't necessarily have to be attached to walls. This way we're doing it here is suitable for a one-car garage, but if you're in a two-car garage, one of those posts can be freestanding, and I suppose you could have both of those posts freestanding if your particular workspace happened to require it. You will, however, have to come up with a way to keep those posts in position until we can get the top shelf installed. And don't be concerned about strength. These posts don't need the walls to support them. It's just a convenient place to hold them while we're getting that top shelf installed. Next, we're going to cut the two center front posts to length in the same manner as we did for the side posts. Now once these are cut, we're not going to install them yet. You can just put them aside until later, but you really should mark them so that you don't mistakenly swap them around. In other words, once you've cut them, they're a custom fit for that location, and they shouldn't be moved to another position. Now that all the posts are cut to length and the outer posts are installed against the walls, it's time to build and install the top shelf. Now, since the length of the shelves that we're building is just a little under 10 feet, the 8-foot piece of plywood that we have cut is too short to make the full shelf length. This is what those two short pieces labeled the top and bottom shelf end sections are for in the second sheet of plywood that we purchased. Now we can't be exact about the length without measuring the precise space between the left and right walls of our garage or the work area that you're building into. So each of these shelves is going to be custom fit again to the space required. In our case, the total shelf length is going to be 114.5 inches. And since the length of the plywood board is 96 inches or 8 feet, we will subtract 96 from 114.5 to give us a remainder of 18.5 inches. That will be the required length of the top shelf end extension, and we're going to go ahead and cut that with the saber saw. As it shows here on the left side of the drawing, we're going to use a piece of 1x4 material as a splice plate to hold the ends of these two pieces of plywood together until we get it up into position. Now notice in that drawing that you need to cut that splice board so that it fits between the 1x4 boards at the front and the back of the shelf. Notice that I've drawn it with a pronounced gap at the front and the back of that splice plate to make sure there's plenty of room for those vertical 1x4 boards. Now it's time to break out that construction adhesive and load it into your caulking gun. Spread a good amount of this across the top surface of that reinforcing plate, and then carefully lift one end of your main shelf section for the top shelf, that's the 8-foot long board, so that it covers half of that reinforcing plate. While you're moving that piece of plywood into position, I recommend you place some scrap pieces of 1x4 material under it to help hold it level, and then fasten it down with 5 or 6 1 to 1.5 inch drywall screws to hold it tightly in place while the construction adhesive sets. Before that glue does set, however, bring your extension piece, the one that we cut to 18.5 inches, and push it tightly against the end of the main piece of plywood. Then screw it in place in a similar fashion, and then leave that assembly for at least an hour or two to dry. When you're finished, that joint should look something like this, with virtually no gap visible at all. By the way, take note of the warm clothing because we are working in the middle of winter with the garage door open. And indirectly, that cold weather is the reason I'm doing this with still photos instead of video. When I tried to set up a camera to shoot video, it kept getting in the way when we were moving the lumber back and forth to take it out onto the driveway to cut. And since there was so much ice on the driveway, we were already stumbling around trying not to fall down carrying the lumber, so I figured having the camera in the way was just an added risk that we didn't need. When the weather warms up, I'll go back to shooting my usual video. The next step is to finish assembling the top shelf, and we do that by adding the 1x4 fascia board. But before we screw it on, we want to run a bead of construction adhesive down the entire top edge of that 1x4 board. Now this can get messy and it's kind of hard to clean this stuff up, so I strongly recommend that you make a thin bead when you do this. In other words, don't apply too much glue because it's going to squeeze out and you'll have a mess to clean up. Notice that I show the shelf is sitting up off the floor on some scrap 2x4s. And I did that just as a convenience to make it easier to get that 1x4 underneath it and attached without smearing too much glue around. Once you have the 1x4 safely in position under the edge of the plywood, you can go ahead and screw it down. Now you can use 1 inch to 1.5 inch screws, but use plenty of them. I think we put about 1 every 6 inches on the shelf that we assembled. The reason we use so many is I want that glue to have a good strong bond, and the screws are primarily there to hold the two parts together until the glue sets. Double check while you're putting the screws in that the 1x4 board stays flush with the front edge of that piece of plywood. The more accurate you are with the alignment of this assembly, the stronger and more attractive the final structure will be. Once that completed shelf assembly is dry, it's time to lift it up and put it in position. It's definitely a good idea to have 2 people and 2 ladders to do this to keep from bending the shelf too much until you get it up against the wall where it's supported at the rear by that 1x4. Once you do get it in position though, you can screw it down, and I don't recommend that you put construction adhesive along that back 1x4 board for the simple reason that you don't need it. It's held rigid by being attached to the wall, so it doesn't have a problem with flexing. Just secure the rear of the plywood with some of those 1.5 inch screws down through the plywood into the 1x4 like you did on the front face. Now take a couple of 2.5 inch screws and drive one down through each front corner through the shelf into the 2x4 as it shows here. And then add a couple more of those 1.5 inch screws through each end of the 1x4 board into those same vertical 2x4s. At this point, that shelf is pretty strong even without those 2 center posts, and in fact Piper just climbed up the ladder and jumped on top of that shelf to put in the rear screws. I don't recommend that you do that because you really do need those center posts for full strength, but it did show how tough it is even without them. And now we're down to the home stretch with this project. Time to assemble and install the combination shelf and workbench. Essentially, it has a lot in common with the upper shelf, but it's different in 2 very important ways. First of all, after we assemble the 2 portions of plywood, we have to notch them to fit around all of these 2x4 posts. Once we get those notches accurately cut and tested the fit of the plywood, we are going to insert the plywood shelf, clamp it into position, and then install the 2 center 2x4 vertical posts. Once we have the 2 center posts placed in position and checked for plumb, we will finally install the front 1x4 board, completing the whole assembly. Start building the lower shelf the same way you did the upper shelf. First, measure from wall to wall the distance between the right and left ends of the entire structure. Then subtract 96 inches from that. The 96 inches represents the longer piece of plywood. Your remainder then will be the length of the extension piece that you're going to cut with your jigsaw, and then once you have that piece cut, you can attach it using the same process of a reinforcing plate on the back with some construction adhesive and screws. Once that assembly is dried completely, we need to mark it for the notches to accommodate those vertical posts. There are several ways you could do this. I suppose you could just measure it all with a tape measure and transfer it onto the board, but we chose to lift the shelf assembly into place as shown here, and then marking the position of the rear posts on the back edge of the shelf. Now we can set the shelf back flat on the floor and extend those marks that we made all the way across the board from the back to the front, the lines shown here in pink. Now use a piece of scrap 1x4 to make marks 3/4 of an inch back from the front edge of the board as shown. Now use a piece of scrap 2x4 to mark the ends of the slots for all 8 of the places where we're going to notch for the vertical 2x4s. Note that the front notches are set back 3/4 of an inch using that mark you made with the 1x4 in the previous step. Once you've got all the notches marked, go ahead and cut them out with your jigsaw the same way you cut the notches in the vertical posts. After you've cut the notches out, your shelf should look like this, Notice that in this photograph, the upper edge is the front edge of the shelf because it has those longer notches. Now test the fit of those notches by angling the shelf in the way you did when you were marking for the notches and see if they fit. And don't be surprised if one or more of those notches is a little too tight and you have to take it back out and enlarge it a bit with your saw. And if you accidentally make any of those notches a little bit too big, leaving a gap, don't worry, we can easily hide it. And in most cases you won't even notice once the whole thing's assembled anyway. Once you're happy with the fit, put a couple of clamps under the corner posts to hold it roughly in position. You can put a level across it at this point, but it's not important that it be perfect yet. Here's what ours looked like at this point, and you can see there's quite a bit of sag in the middle because we haven't got the front 1x4 in place yet. So that's why you don't really need to worry too much about leveling it. We are using bar clamps. You can see a pair of them on the floor, and the two that are holding the shelf up are almost invisible. You definitely need a bubble level for the next step, so we started looking around for ours on the floor, and feel free to laugh when you figure out where we left it. Now it's time to put in those last two vertical posts. Now be sure you put them in the correct position. We marked them carefully to make sure that we knew which one is on the left side, which one on the right. Angle them in at the top so they slip under that upper 1x4 and then slide them back into their respective notches. They should be a reasonably tight fit, but you may need a couple of clamps to hold them up in position. Set a bubble level on each one in turn and adjust them back and forth until they're perfectly plumb. Before you attach them, however, step back and take a look at them. You'd be surprised how accurate your own eyeballs can be at aligning things. Even if they're not perfectly plumb, it's better if they line up with the rear posts. Regardless of whether those front posts are perfectly plumb, if they don't line up with the rear post, the whole thing's going to look a little wonky and your craftsmanship will be criticized. Once you're happy with how those posts look, secure them at the top with a 2.5-inch screw. With those center vertical posts in place, we can install the 1x4 faceboard. This is going to take some juggling because there's already a couple of clamps, one at each end, holding that shelf up, and you're going to have to move them in order to get the 1x4 board in there. First, run a thin bead of your construction adhesive along the top edge of the 1x4. Have your helper support one end of that shelf so you can take that clamp off. Then you can slide the 1x4 into position under that end of the shelf and clamp it in place. Do the same thing to the other end, and then loosen the clamps slightly one at a time and move each end up and down, watching your bubble level until you have that bottom shelf perfectly level and you're happy with it in its final position. Now drive a couple of 1.5 to 2-inch screws through the faceboard into each post, and then drive some 1.5-inch screws down through the plywood surface into the 1x4 rails at both the front and the back like you did for the top shelf. Hopefully all has gone well and your shelf assembly now looks like this. If you have any glue squeeze out, like you can see here along the top of our bottom 1x4, that sort of smudgy gray line, it can be wiped up with alcohol so you have a clean surface to paint over. Additional minor considerations regarding aesthetics are these little spaces left over from cutting the notches in that plywood shelf. We just cut some little scraps of plywood and stuffed them in there with some construction adhesive. Once the adhesive sets up, you can sand those pieces flush with the rest of the material so that it will disappear once it's painted. The final step in part 1 of our 2-part video series will complete the structure and turn it into a strong and very durable unit. We're going to cut pieces of our remaining 1x4 material to run as cross pieces between the front face board and the rear face board as shown here in pink. If possible, cut each board so that it will fit snugly in place, and that way it will hold itself there while you're installing the screws. Apply some construction adhesive to the top of each board when you're ready to install it, then push it into position and drive a couple of 1.5-inch screws sideways through the ends of each of these cross pieces into the 2x4 vertical posts. Then go up to the top of the shelf that you're working on and drive at least 3 or 4 more of the 1.5-inch screws down through the plywood into each of these cross pieces. This is what those cross pieces look like once they're installed. If you look closely, you'll notice the one closest to the camera is actually a 2x4, and that's just because we were trying to use up some of the last of our construction materials. Once these screws are installed and the adhesive cures, this structure becomes very rigid. Each section framed by the 1x4s forms a partial torque box. The plywood transfers its loads to the 1x4s. The 1x4s transfer that load to the vertical posts, and the posts then again transfer these loads into the walls and the floor of the garage. Since the bottoms of the 2 front vertical posts are unsecured, we installed some metal angles with masonry screws. If you decide to do the same, you don't need to use angles this big. I was just using up some odds and ends that I had in my leftover hardware supply. And with that, our storage shelves and workbench unit are complete. It's very useful as is, but there are several possibilities for enhancing it with some added features or even beefing it up if you're planning on putting some very heavy loads on your workbench portion in the center. I can even think of a few ways to increase the bench area by incorporating some folding work surfaces. We'll discuss all of those ideas in the next video. As always, thanks very much for watching. If you like this video, please help us out and give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate the support. And remember, if you want a better life, do it yourself.